was meant. The U.S. vetoed it. Nicaragua then went to the General Assembly, which passed similar resolutions in successive years. The United States and Israel opposed. In 1 year, they got El Salvador. All of this is out of history. It has to be. It's just inconsistent with our preferred image of what history is supposed to be. And as I say, you can check how much this has been. These are uncontroversial cases. You can check to see how much it's been referred to recently. And remember who were the individuals responsible. People like Negroponte, proconsul of Honduras, Rumsfeld, special envoy to the Middle East, and so on, and others. Plenty of continuity. Well, the U.S. reacted, as I said, by escalating the war, and also for the first time giving official orders to its mercenary forces to attack what are called soft targets. That's what the Southern Command called them, soft targets, meaning undefended civilian targets, agricultural cooperatives, and so on. That was known. It was discussed in the United States. It was considered legitimate by the left. So Michael Kinsley, who represents the left in mainstream debate, he had an interesting article. He was then editor of the New Republic, in which he said that we shouldn't be too quick to condemn State Department authorization for attacks on undefended civilian targets because we have to apply pragmatic criteria. We have to carry out cost-benefit analysis and see whether, as he put it, the amount of blood poured in is compensated by a good outcome, namely democracy, what we will determine to be democracy. And what that means you could see by looking at the states next door, like El Salvador and Guatemala, which were okay democracies. And if it passes our test, then it's okay. So in other words, international terrorism is fine, assuming it meets pragmatic criteria, and now across the spectrum, left to right, among we, that is, educated, privileged intellectuals, not the population, of course. In Nicaragua, the population had an army to defend it. It was bad enough. I mean, tens of thousands of people killed, the country practically devastated, may never recover, but it had an army to defend it. In El Salvador and Guatemala, that wasn't true. The army was the state terrorists, the U.S.-supported state terrorists. They were the army. There was nobody to defend the population. And in fact, the atrocities were far worse. Also, they're not a state, so they couldn't go to the World Court and the Security Council to follow legal means, of course, without any effect, because we, people like us, have determined that the world is going to be ruled by force, not by law. And since we have the power, as long as we determine that, a state that tries to follow the legitimate means of responding to international terrorism has nothing to do. But that's our choice, nobody else's choice. You can't blame anyone else on that, for that. In order to carry out, there was, however, enough popular resistance, not elite resistance, but popular resistance to the atrocities there that the U.S. had to resort to an international terrorist network, an extraordinary international terrorist network. Remember, the U.S. is a powerful state. It's not like Libya. Libya wants to carry out terrorist acts. They hire, Carlos the Jackal or something. The United States hires terrorist states. We're big guys. So the terrorist network consisted of Taiwan, Britain, Israel, Argentina, at least as long as it was under the rule of the neo-Nazi generals. When they were unfortunately removed, they fell out of the system, Saudi Arabian funding. Quite a substantial international terrorist network, never been anything like it. In contemporary terms, we might call it an axis of evil, I suppose. The outcome, again, keeping to the guidelines, we believe our leaders, the result was hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered, millions of orphans and refugees, every conceivable atrocity, the region devastated. The single uncontroversial case, Nicaragua, which was the least of them, that alone far surpasses the crimes of September 11th, and the others suffered far worse. This is again, we're bending over backwards and giving the U.S. the benefit of the doubt, so we're only calling it international terrorism organized by depraved opponents of civilization itself. Well, that's the second major area, Central America. All of this, however, is off the record, too, in the current history journal, and it's typical in this respect. Nothing that I just have referred to is mentioned, nor is it in the whole scholarly literature, in fact, except way at the margins. You can check and see. It just doesn't count. The 80s are described as the era of state-sponsored international terrorism, but they're not referring to any of these things. The U.S. was trying to prevent state-sponsored international terrorism by taking proactive means, like the most massive international terrorist network that's ever been known. That's very typical of the scholarly literature, journalism, and again, you can do a check. There's barely been a word about any of this, as the second phase of the war on terror has been declared once again with pretty much the same people and every reason to expect similar outcomes. Well, let's continue. From all of this, an obvious conclusion follows. There is an operational definition of terrorism, the one that's actually used. It means terror that they carry out against us. That's terrorism. Nothing else passes through the filter. Furthermore, that's, as far as I know, that's a historical universal. I can't find an exception to that. You might try. So, for example, the Japanese in China and Manchuria were defending the population against Chinese terrorists and going to create an earthly paradise for them if they could control the terrorists. The Nazis in occupied Europe were defending the legitimate governments like Vichy and the population from the terrorist partisans who were supported from abroad, as indeed they were. They were run from London and Poland and France and so on. The fact, as I say, I can't find an exception. You might try. Also, as far as I'm aware, this is virtually universal among intellectuals, educated folks like us. Apart from statistical error, this is the line that they take. Now, it doesn't look that way in history, but you have to remember who writes history. You know, that ought to leave you with a little bit of skepticism. If you look at actual history, not the one that's written, I think you'll find that this is the case. And I could even maybe suggest it as a research topic to some enterprising graduate student who aspires to a career as a taxi driver. Just to continue to the present, let's just take the last couple of months. September 11th was a perfectly clear example of international terrorism. No controversy about that, so we don't have to waste time on it. What about the reaction? Well, it turns out the reaction is also an uncontroversial case of international terrorism. Again, let's keep to the guidelines. We'll just listen to what our leaders say. So on October 11th, President Bush announced to the Afghan people that we will keep bombing you until you hand over people who we suspect of terrorist acts, although we refuse to provide any evidence and we refuse to enter into negotiations for extradition and transfer. Clear case of international terrorism. On October 28th, the British counterpart, Admiral Sir Michael Boyce, who's the chief of the British Defence Staff, took it a step further. 3 weeks after, you have to remember, getting rid of the Taliban regime was not a war aim. That was an afterthought. And 3 weeks after the bombing began, that was added, presumably so that intellectuals would have something to feel good about or something, I don't know. Anyway, 3 weeks after the bombing, that was added as a new war aim. And Admiral Boyce announced to the Afghan people accordingly, I think this is the first mention of this war aim, that we will continue bombing you until you change your leadership. Okay. First, that was all very prominent, like page 1 of the New York Times in both cases. Two, both cases are textbook illustrations of international terrorism, if not aggression, but we're still bending over backwards. And it's all off the record by the usual convention. We're doing it, so it doesn't count. It's only when they carry out what we officially define as terrorism that it counts. Well, it's easy to go on, but let me just return to the weak thesis. There can't be a war against terrorism, at least against as terrorism is defined in official U.S. documents. It's a logical impossibility. This is a small sample of illustrations. You can go on easily, but it's enough to show that that can't be true. That's the weak thesis. What about the strong thesis, that it's all so entirely obvious that it ought to even be embarrassing to talk about it because it's all right on the surface. Nothing hidden about any of this. Everything I mentioned is perfectly well known. You didn't have to penetrate anything to discover it. No obscure sources, nothing, just the obvious evidence. And it's very easily, you can easily add to it. There's a ton of literature about it for the last 20 years. But that's all off that literature also can't be discussed because it comes out with the wrong conclusion. So it's treated the same way terrorism is in our intellectual culture. Again, a choice, not a necessity. So we end up with kind of a dilemma. If we're not honest, forget it. If we are honest, there's a dilemma. One possibility is just to acknowledge that we are total hypocrites, that we don't, and then to at least have the decency to stop talking about things like human rights and right and wrong and good and evil and so on, and just say, yeah, we're hypocrites. We have force, and we're going to rule the world by force. Period. Let's forget about everything else. The other option is harder to pursue, but it's imperative. Unless we would like to contribute to still worse disasters that are likely to lie ahead.
Show.